like to call this House to order. Welcome to the semi-finals of WAustrals 2016. Congratulations to teams who've made it this far. On affirmative, we have Monash 2. And on negative, we have USU 1. Glad to have such a big audience, but that also means that in between debates and in between speeches, please refrain from making loud noises. Even if you're snapping, if it's a lot of people snapping, it's still a lot of noise. So make sure that in order to support your team, that you don't ruin their chances of winning because we can't hear them. That would be great. Otherwise, feel free to whistle or do whatever before the speeches start. Having said that, would like to call the first speaker of the affirmative to present the case on this.
Madam Speaker, at this tournament, Monash 2 has supported individuals' rights to elect to become stateless. We've supported individuals' right to be stampeded at Mecca if that's what they choose. And today's debate is a long line in supporting libertarianism, something I never thought I'd ever say. We on side affirmative are absolutely happy to stand by a corporation's right not to be taxed. We think it's right, we think it is legitimate for them, and we absolutely think it is beneficial for the state. What is our model going to be in today's debate? We would obviously cut all corporate tax as per topic. We would also largely cut redistributive policies. So we think that involves things such as abolishing the minimum wage. We think that means things such as abolishing middle class welfare, and we would have an aggressive social safety net. But beyond that, that's about it. So, 2 points to bring you in this debate. Firstly, what is the purpose of taxation? Why do we think corporate tax is actually fundamentally opposed to that? Secondly, why do we think this causes the state to flourish in particularly beneficial ways? And I'll obviously talk about the working and abject poor within that. So, what is the purpose of taxation? We would say that taxation is absolutely part of the social contract where you consent to help other citizens at the point at which you know they're going to help you in return. And that's an important thing to recognise in this debate, because we accept that taxation is actually a form of theft, as I'll go into in a moment. And at the point that is true, we are happy to stand by it, if and only if you as an individual get definable benefit from that. We think that's an important thing to recognise. We therefore think that tax has to work on an interpersonal level, because we think there is a quid pro quo to that. Importantly, we think corporations are distinct from that, which is why we don't think they should be part of it. So why is it unfair of businesses? So at the point that we would say that taxation is a form of theft by the government, we therefore set a very high bar of benefit being gained to those people in order to make it right. Why do we think it is unfair to tax businesses in this way, therefore? We would firstly say that businesses do not currently benefit from the social safety net. So in the same way that we're happy for individuals to pay tax because we recognise that when they end up in a situation where they're poor, they get benefits from the government, we don't think the same thing accrues to businesses. So at the point you're taxing them for that, we think that's fundamentally unfair. But secondly, it's very important to recognise that businesses do not get a say politically. To the extent that we accept that they do have political clout, obviously, we do not think that actually manifests in ways that means they can affect government policy to a legitimate extent, because they are in all ways unenfranchised in that situation. Yes, they have the ability to campaign and try and suggest to other people what they think, but at the point when someone goes to the ballot box, businesses have absolutely no say in that. What does that mean? It firstly means they cannot affect policy as it's happening, but secondly it means when a government does something anti that business, they don't actually have the ability to call that government out and vote them out at the ballot box later. Just because you have political clout does not necessarily mean you are enfranchised. We don't think at the point you can affect government policy in that way, it is fair to tax you. But secondly, we would say that the corporate president actively achieves welfare goals for the government. That's on a few different levels. Firstly, for every person that a corporation gives a job to, that is a person the government does not have to give welfare for. Secondly, when businesses enter a country, they tend to invest in huge amounts of infrastructure development. We think that benefits the government because the government then also does not have to do it themselves. But thirdly, we'd say they often give huge forms of scholarships and individuals. So they often train people up, they often offer them degrees and offer to pay for those degrees because they recognise the benefit that gives that business. Important to recognise that if the negative team thinks that corporations do have a burden to society, which we're possibly willing to concede to some level, they already discharge that burden in doing all these things. Because they already make the government's job easier when they do that. We think that's absolutely principally consistent with the purposes of taxation. We think to any extent they discharge their burden at that point. But thirdly and importantly, we would say that when you tax a business, you are actually taxing people twice. Because those people are already paying income tax. So at the point in which you think that is important, they have already discharged their social burden in that regard. We think that is actually drastically unfair for those people. Why does this cause the state to flourish? We would firstly say it's important to recognise that it's actually quite an inefficient form of taxation. Because at the point you take from companies, instead of then just giving it directly to workers, and then give that directly to workers, we think that's quite inefficient and not beneficial for the government. But recognise a few things in this debate. Firstly, that some companies already avoid tax under the status quo. And let's look at what some of those companies are. Because they're companies such as Google and Facebook. And what are some features of those companies? They're companies that tend to invest heavily in their workers, because they recognise that at the point they seem to have possibly a slightly negative perception for avoiding tax, they should probably invest in their workers, but that's the first reason. But it's secondly because they have extra disposable income to do that. We think some of the happiest workers are workers who work for those kind of companies. But let's go outside of just arguing by example and look at it on a logical level. Why would they invest that money back in the company? The first thing to recognise is they don't invest that money back in the company. That means they're investing in individuals. That money's going to come back to the government anyway through income tax. That's absolutely fine under our side of the house. But secondly, we see that in all situations, when you increase corporate tax, the way that works for corporations is they don't suddenly take a tax cut for the CEO. What they do is they lay off workers. That shows that the way that corporations act is likely to be logical in that regard. What have I written here? Oh, also, we see that when governments want to get businesses into their country, they often incentivise that by lowering tax rate. I think that's going to cause more businesses to enter into the nation in beneficial ways. But thirdly, we say that even if it doesn't directly benefit workers, innovation is a really, really beneficial thing for poor people and for everyone in society. And the example we'd like to use for this is that 20 years ago, if you had a fridge, if you had a TV, if you had a phone, they were all considered luxury goods. Nowadays, even the most poor in society generally have that. The reason for that isn't because of government redistributive policies, it's because businesses have invested in innovation to the extent that those things become incredibly cheap. So even if you don't believe that the businesses directly benefit workers, they indirectly do those things because they invest in innovation in ways that's particularly beneficial. But why don't we get more innovation under our side of the house? Firstly, we would say that companies naturally have an incentive to put profits into innovation. But secondly, we would say that they only can do that at the point they have excess money. Because normally innovation has huge sunk costs with it, and you don't see those benefits till later down the track. At the point at which you're taking away that profit, that is realistically probably a large amount of what you're doing for these businesses, you make it impossible for them to innovate. We think that is likely to occur under their side of the house. And even if they still do get some innovation, you have to accept that's likely to be, to a lesser extent, that's particularly important. Finally, why do we think businesses are actually better at helping the most poor people in society? Because it's important to recognise that the abject poor are actually the people who are locked out under the status quo. And this is why we were quite happy to oppose things such as the minimum wage. We thought they were particularly damaging for the most poor people in society. Why was that? It was because of middle class and working poor capture. It was because the enfranchisement offered by unions only protected those people who currently had jobs. It meant that often came at the cost of the abject poor through things such as the minimum wage. Why do we think businesses helped that better? Because we thought businesses always had an incentive when they didn't have any corporate tax rate and they didn't have any minimum wage to employ a larger number of people. We thought that was going to provide the final benefits to those individuals in particularly beneficial ways for them. Madam Speaker, we always thought corporate tax was a form of theft, but more importantly, the point at which you couldn't point to the final benefits those businesses we thought that was unconscionable. We actually thought we'd help the poor people in the best possible way. That's why we proposed.
We think the affirmative one for this. Please call on the negative one. Emma?
Go, Emma. height of generosity to that case and what it looks like, and say businesses contribute much more than society gives them in education and workers and all the benefits of profit, and say they give training, we would still tax the amount of that they don't do and the amount that they are bad to society, and also the amount, whether or not it's just, that it's necessary to address inequality. So if they just want to lower tax generally, that's fine, but we would prefer corporate tax over other forms of tax, and I'm going to explain that in this speech. And let's note that even their best version of a safety net uses about 35% of what we collect in tax at the moment, so let's not pretend that's nothing and they don't have to tax anything. But now I'm going to move to the other part, which is that in reality, corporations draw an enormous amount of benefit from society and what the government gives them, and also often are incredibly bad for workers and come at the direct cost of wages to workers and do things like offshoring labour, which we think is a justification for taxing them, which is what I'm going to explain in this speech. The first thing I'm going to do is point out here what their idea of cutting redistribution looks like, and make a clear statement of what I said before. If they believe in cutting tax generally, because we believe most of the arguments about you not benefiting that much from tax or contributing more to society than the government gives you are also true of individuals, they're also true of other wealth tax, in which case, even if it's slightly more to companies, we would still tax companies more and have corporate tax exist in that system. The idea of a safety net they're talking about, if it's to do anything in society, has to be pretty significant. We believe it probably should be more, and there are some other harms to, for instance, not allowing incentivization of responsible behaviour or supporting poor people to the maximum extent. They need to do a bit more to justify that. First issue in this speech then, is it just and is tax theft? And to be honest, Madam Speaker, this is not the most important issue, but I'm just going to deal with it now. Firstly, does there need to be an interpersonal benefit or any benefit at all? First thing to say here, we do not believe there is a justification for you needing to benefit in order to get something back from tax. We don't ask you how much you benefit from tax. Often rich people are taxed more. We assume that they don't support no proportional taxation on rich people, which indicates there's some level of compromise there. But also, we would say that to the extent businesses do benefit society in the form of training programs or paying workers higher wages so you don't have to pay for welfare, we in effect do give them less tax for that, because corporate tax is on profits and on dividends paid to shareholders, which means if you pay your workers more, that's in effect tax deductible, which means that that benefit's already taken care of. Additionally, if corporations do provide benefits in theory, we prefer to tax them at the point they're not providing those benefits and otherwise provide an incentive for corporations to act well in the ways that they want them to. We would also prefer that determination to be made by the government than corporations to decide where else that money can go, since that money can also go to massive bonuses to the CEOs who are more able to evade taxation on that money, or to dividends, which apparently in their radically less tax world we assume is not going to get a lot of support for taxing that kind of wealth, which is already the most unequal form. But additionally, they said briefly they said this is taxing twice, which we would say that you could do things like tax dividends. We also tax multiple asset sales because they continue to have a benefit. That's not an actual justification. Further on the issue of why it's just. The first thing to say here substantively is that governments put an enormous amount into businesses and businesses take up the resources of a state, which is why we support things like an enormous Scandinavian tax on their oil boom, because the existence of those companies takes up workers and resources and causes inflation in the state, which causes other consequences. But additionally, the state provides things like education and training, much more so than companies and in a more general level, but also provides things like healthcare and workers, which allows a sustainable workforce and easier hiring and firing of workers, which is contrary to what they said. So it's not just that you take a worker off the state's hands, the state's been putting everything into them to make that worker feasible for you in the first place. So we think at that point, it's beneficial to tax them. We would also note here that they're not actually getting rid of tax if they're still doing things like income tax, since that's indirectly a tax on companies by forcing those companies to increase wages due to workers' demands, at which point the principled argument basically falls down, but we would prefer that tax be direct so that it's enforceable, and secondly, not levied on people who are more likely to be poor and less likely to have other sources of support. Those things they need to justify comparatively why companies, it's less just to be able to tax them. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the second issue, which is what are the specific benefits of being able to tax in this way. Alright, so why is it effective in a particular way? The first thing here is that it captures specific benefits that you would lose through any other form of taxation or trying to extract a benefit. So for instance, companies like Facebook and Google that actually have very low employment compared to their profitability would not be taxed very much under any system of income taxation. That's also true of companies that offshore offshore their labour, but still use the regulatory systems of countries like Australia and New Zealand, and put off an enormous amount of work. So we think that's both arbitrary in the sense of which companies are more likely to be taxed, particularly if we care about low-income workers who are more likely to be working in places like steel mills or mines than Facebook or Google, so not benefiting from any of the things that they're talking about. And those benefits are very difficult to capture in any tax system. And if that tax system is worse off, it hits those people hardest, and they're the ones who don't have access to a welfare system. Secondly, enforcement is better under this system. It is much easier for wealthy individuals to put their individual assets into ways that are easily evaded, put them offshore, or put them into other assets or in foundations, than it is for companies who are subject to public scrutiny and the scrutiny of shareholders. Now, obviously, there's significant corporate tax evasion, but we would say you should put your efforts into looking at that and pressuring shareholders to make companies comply, rather than the whole suite of private tax evasion that is also extremely successful if you're talking about the CEOs of Facebook. Thirdly, we think this disincentivizes the hiring of workers and economic growth in that particular sector. So, in effect now, if you hire workers, that doesn't come at the cost of your corporate, that lessens your corporate tax because it lessens your profit if you pay more, but now there's an disincentive to hire those workers because you have to pay them more in a system where they're being taxed instead of you. So we think that disincentivizes you actually hiring labour, which leads to things like companies like Coles and Woolworths, more using automatic technology, even when it's less efficient than workers, because it's more profitable for them. So if you care about keeping those workforces in work and in benefit, then that is a benefit. But also, that's the problem you create for the state when they then have to pay significant amounts of welfare to those people. We also would say that it's significantly less distortionary than things like income tax, because if you're getting corporately taxed, it's only on profit, it's less likely to make projects unprofitable than on income tax, where you have a whole other series of factors to take into account that are more likely to hit significantly poor people more, who have to take into account other factors, and we think those things are a problem. What else did they say? They said there's an incentive to invest in innovation, and innovation is productive for society. The first thing we would say is that it's often unlikely that innovation actually happens. For many companies, they just invest in their senior executives. Secondly, that innovation could also be done by investing tax revenue into other innovation. Thirdly, if companies innovate well and you want to incentivize that, you can use a tax break on corporate tax, which is not behaviour that you can incentivize when you do not have corporate tax. Lastly, what are the harmful effects of any alternative that you get? The first thing I want to say here is to reflect on what exactly their system is. Because we think it's true that when you remove corporate tax, there's less push and less desire to have tax on individual people because they think they're being screwed over when companies don't have to pay any tax, which means it's very unlikely you get very much tax revenue at all, which means it's very difficult to do any kind of public projects or any of the education and training that they think is important. But income tax is also very bad because it means it's very difficult to be flexible. You couldn't, for instance, tax the workers of small businesses less than of big businesses or of good businesses for society. But wealthier people are also significantly less likely to pay income tax. So if we're just talking about increasing income tax in general, those wealthier people are less likely to be hit hard by it and less likely to pay it at all, which means that you proportionately hit poorer people more. Madam Speaker, corporate tax is an incredibly useful tool for society, and it's incredibly useful payment against companies that get a lot out of society. Removing it damages everything that they and we care about. We're very proud to oppose.
The negative one for their speech, call on affirmative to who prefers to pronounce speak.
Madam Speaker, our world admittedly looks like one where you don't get your baby bonus, where you don't get your renewable energy rebate. But our world also looks like one where even the poorest of people in our society have access to the sorts of cutting-edge technology that we maybe can't imagine right now, and where they get that access cheaper and earlier. We think that those are changes which do improve people's lives in tangible ways. Our world maybe looks like one where you eventually go to a Google school that allows you to borrow against your future income to pay that off. We think that's the sort of libertarian utopia that we're proposing on our side of the house. Well, I stand in front of you today in the West Farmers Lecture Theatre. This is the way of the future. 3 questions in my speech. Firstly, like the principal idea of is it moral to tax corporations? Secondly, practical like what benefits do we lose? And thirdly, a comparative of why trickle-down economics was always better at protecting the welfare of the poorest as opposed to redistributive taxation. On to the first question. Sam gave you a bunch of reasons in his speech why he thought it was unjust that we taxed corporations. The first one was the social contract. We said that corporations don't opt into a social contract whereby they agree to pay personal taxation in like accord for a certain degree of protection. Insofar as Emma pointed us to some benefits that corporations maybe get, we think that those are broadly because they protect the people involved rather than the corporations themselves. We think in a lot of ways corporations are punished for existing in our society. But the second thing to note was that she was like, rich people don't get benefit out of their tax, ergo we tax without benefit all the time. But that ignored what we told you, which was that even if you were a rich person in society obtaining no tangible benefit right now, you existed on the assumption that at the point your life turned around for some unfortunate reason, that benefit would flow down to you long term, with that reciprocity that never existed for corporations. They weren't guaranteed a bailout at the point they collapsed it the same way an individual was, right? Like that was the idea of why it was unfair. But then she was like, oh, but like, sorry, with regards to what we said about double taxation, she was like, but we only tax your profits, so we're not taxing the stuff that flows through to the workers. But like, shock and horror, Madam Speaker. Investing in education and research and development can often be hugely profitable for companies down the line, right? We just like, you know, I thought it was a bizarre counterfactual they brought us that somehow investing in education meant necessarily taking a cut in your profits. We thought that if you were doing that well as a corporation, that was necessarily untrue. So the double taxation material absolutely stood. We thought that you got more of that education at the point you weren't being doubly taxed on it, but more of that later. With regards to political capture, we told you that corporations didn't get a vote. Insofar as like business had influence, it was counterbalanced by the influence of unions. We didn't get a meaningful say in who was the government and what those policy settings were. But finally, we told you it was particularly inefficient. I'm going to deal with the stuff about tax avoidance in a bit more detail later. But at the point corporations were so well versed in avoiding tax, it became a particularly unpredictable revenue stream for the government, which means it was difficult to rely on. But secondly, at the point that the biggest corporations were the best at avoiding tax, we thought that burden necessarily fell on the small and medium businesses that they wanted to protect. On the first practicality question, can we feasibly provide the social safety net we wanted to without corporate tax? Emma tells us it's still 35% of the government's revenue. Like, sure, we'd be happy to support a nominal increase in income tax if that was the case. But no, what we say importantly is that we think a lot of that social safety net would be taken over by corporations as a means of providing it. So that's why I'm talking about like schools provided by corporation, education provided by corporations. We think that is the way of the future. We think it's particularly profitable. We think that corporations like Google have shown an vested interest in providing that sort of education. We think that that can work. What were the unique benefits that Emma gave us with regards to corporate taxation? The first thing she told us was that because the state has invested in your workers, that like necessarily you benefit from that. But those workers also had to pay off the education that the state had given them in the form of their own income tax. So we didn't think that that was necessarily fair. We thought that like at the point the corporation actually gave that person a job and enabled them to pay the income tax that repaid the state, we thought the corporation had discharged their burden. We didn't always think that was true. Furthermore, we thought the corporations invested in a lot of unique development that the government never could. We thought they were value adders there. With regards to the stuff about offshoring, the first thing to note was that corporations that offshored or like had low employment to profitability ratios were often the biggest tax avoiders in this debate. Like the idea that we're taking like millions of dollars of tax revenue from Facebook under status quo is pretty laughable in this debate. But the second thing we would say is that at that point they're not getting the benefit of the onshore workers that they wanted to use as justification for taxing that company, right? But furthermore, they benefit from the regulatory structure. We'd say the reason they moved their labour offshore was because the regulatory structure and the tax structure was prohibited for that company to operate and empower workers within that state's own boundaries. Finally, with regards, oh no, not finally. No, not finally, okay. But looking at evasion now. The first thing was they didn't provide any reason why it was necessarily easier to police the the corporate offshoring of companies as opposed to individuals. We would say that often it is far more legal to offshore your revenue as a company than it is as an individual. At the point we could police individuals with existing laws, we thought that that was probably easier. But the second thing, the second thing we would say, no, that's a different point. Finally, with regards to her stuff about not being able to use tax breaks as an incentive anymore. If cutting a company's tax marginally under status quo incentivizes them to innovate, presumably reducing that to zero maximizes. We thought that was pretty clear. We thought that was analysis as for us. In the idea that these corporations would somehow irrationally act to trade away their profit to innovate in a way that to get a tax break, we thought that was likely to be a zero-sum game. We thought that the tax break we were providing was probably ludicrous, probably didn't exist. So why was it that trickle-down economics were always better at protecting people's welfare than redistributive taxation? On a principled level, we thought you now weren't stealing from people. We were pretty happy to say that, because at the point we were happy to take your income to pay for base welfare, we thought that was a tangible trade-off. The point you were making a judgment call between someone's disposable income and someone else's, we thought that was fundamentally unfair. We thought that was stealing on behalf of the state. Second thing to note, we thought that redistribution via tax revenue locked out the abject poor in a really harmful way. We told you that the working poor and middle class had political capture that locked out the abject poor. That was things like a minimum wage that prohibited disabled workers from getting jobs at the point they weren't able to add that amount of value to the economy. Corporations viewed those same workers as previously as a huge untapped market, as a market that they could enter themselves into to lift those people out of their poverty. We thought they always valued them. Finally, with innovation. At the point corporations can innovate better, they can provide tangible benefits to people, statistics show those slow down. At the point that everyone, even the abject poor today, have a smartphone, we think that's a huge win for corporations. We were so happy to stand on our side of the house.
There was a simple request for the audience to keep it down while the speakers were speaking. We hope everybody here has the decency to carry on with that and not make it difficult for the judges to listen to the speakers. Having said that, we thank the second affirmative for the speech, call on the second negative to present his case, his preferred pronouncement.
In 2012, when BHP and Rio Tinto posted profits of $6 billion each, they did not invest it in innovation. They enacted it as a very simple and straightforward wealth transfer to the very rich. They gave out huge dividends to anyone who owned stock, because otherwise there would be very little incentive to buy stock in the first instance. And secondly, huge bonuses to middle and senior managers, because that's how they attracted and hired extra workers. Let's disabuse ourselves of the utterly ridiculous notion that every small business, every fish and chip shop, every resource firm is Google and investing in huge speculative technology. Most of them are deeply selfish, self-interested companies that have harmed workers and the poor. We should tax them for those reasons. What am I going to do in this speech? The first thing is I'm going to take them at their very best, and I'm going to say, why do the alternatives they propose massively harm everyone they want to talk about? The second thing is I'm going to reiterate why we have a right to tax them in the first instance, then look at the effectiveness of that form of taxation. Let's look first on alternatives, because we're taking them at their very best. The question I had was, well, how are they going to pay for this generous social safety net? Because note that pensions at the moment, something that is in almost no interest of firms because it goes to most people over the age of 65 or 70 who have very low productive capacity to themselves, cost enormous, take up huge percents of the budget. We gave you two alternatives. Either it was going to be an increase in income tax or an increase in consumption tax. What was the harm of income tax? The first was that it was distortionary on an individual basis. That massively increasing my income tax discouraged me from engaging in further work in the future and discouraged me from being as productive as I could. So straight away on that comparative, people have more incentive to work under the negative side of the house. The second thing was a business harm, because it deterred small businesses from hiring labour in the first instance. As Emma told you, this was a massive subsidy to capital, because why would I hire someone when due to their higher tax rates, that was a disincentive, when just like Coles and Woolworths were doing now, I could outsource it to a machine or overseas. That deterred upscaling on a small business level, because when I could only hire Australian workers, it was difficult for me to rise, and encouraged large-scale businesses to go overseas and reduce any of that innovative benefit to the countries where that existed. The alternative there was a consumption tax, which as most people know is super regressive. So this idea of the very poor being helped under that side is a lie. Then we get the ridiculous shift at second negative. We're going to cede it all to the private sphere. Thank God for Google schools. The first thing we need to note is that most businesses will not touch pensions because they are in no way profitable unless you're presupposing that, like by some metric, I would have to pay for my mum and dad's pension because that might be a way that businesses could extract. Secondly, they are highly unlikely to give it to everyone, particularly the most vulnerable people who probably lack skills, who need training, who need education and healthcare, things that are deeply, deeply expensive. But thirdly, we think, we think it's much better if the government manages and is in charge of that. Note that even if they're right that businesses have little political say, it makes no sense to entirely remove the political sway of the populace. Lastly, this ridiculous idea that cutting minimum wage helps support. Yes, Madam Speaker, that's why the almost zero minimum wage in America has had massively socially beneficial outcomes. You know why that's bad? Because when you cut minimum wage, you massively exacerbate the asymmetry between firms and workers, where you have to compete for a job and they don't have to compete to hire you. Under that side of the house, at their very best, they are bad in every instance. Secondly, why do we have a right to tax? This was the most ridiculous thing. I thought in the WAustrals semi-final we could escape a social contract argument. Clearly not. No one has signed the social contract. That's why it's not a good argument. But tax is a deeply instrumental thing about social benefit and about building a society that we can believe in. Let's get to this ridiculous thing. Okay. We only tax you if and only if you get a definable benefit, says First Affirmative. That's deeply untrue because wealthy people are far more likely to use the private sector in the form of private education, private healthcare, and private estates, things like that. They get the least benefit and yet we tax them more. Secondly, it's just a bald-faced lie that businesses don't profit. They profit from things like regulation, which allow them bankruptcy form. They profit from things like law and contract law, which allow them to have safe and stable negotiation of profit. They profit from health and education by having a productive and healthy workforce. But the big one is the unemployment benefit, because that allows them to fire workers. That allows them to shift workers to sectors that are most profitable and productive. So if you cared about the right of them to profit, they profit more under our side when they get a more mobile labour force. This is the next ridiculous claim. Businesses have no political say. Because there's no business lobbies anywhere, super PACs don't exist. But even if they're right at their very best, I'm going to stop being so facetious, but this claim is ridiculous, right? Because businesses are run and employed by people who can vote and who have business interests at heart. Secondly, businesses can donate enormous amounts to groups like the Liberal Party in Australia, the Republicans in America. And it's just an absurd claim to say that even if they have very limited political say, they should pay no tax given the harms we pointed to. Then they say, this is their last definable benefit, but they have some social benefit in infrastructure and training. Note that that is super duper contingent and straight up untrue for an enormous number of businesses. So businesses like Coles and Woolworths and McDonald's that employ low skilled workers and offer very minimal training opportunities but make enormous profits do not do that. Secondly, it's super unequal and disparate. So by their own logic, it relies on you having a super benevolent firm that is happy to invest in your area. That's particularly harmful to people like African Americans or Indigenous Australians who exist outside of the most popular metropolitan areas. The third thing is, even individuals who are net socially beneficial, we still tax, because there are still other purposes, and on aggregate we should tax everyone in order for us to benefit the most. What did we say? Firstly and most importantly, that we should redress inequality, because note that business tax is a tax on profits, right? Not a tax on all business activity. What that means is that it doesn't hurt wages in the way that income tax does. It's a deeply important way of doing so. Secondly, though, is that under the status quo, we have a massive exacerbation of inequality due to the fact that wealth is massively rising at a far greater rate than income, and wealth disparity, as Thomas Piketty would tell you, is one of the greatest causes for global inequality on the planet. At the end of it, we think the reason we need to redress inequality is that it reduces productivity in the market by allowing ghettoized areas, by denying people economic opportunity, by allowing the political system to be captured by the elite. I can't believe I'm explaining why inequality is bad, but honestly, that's the point this debate has gotten to. At the end of this, it's deeply clear that states can and should, because there's no social contract, tax if it's beneficial, it's deeply beneficial, and the alternatives are worse. Why is this still, lastly, a very good form of tax? They said it harms innovation. Again, contingent, and we note that innovation can exist in lots of other areas. Note the massive innovation that existed in artificial intelligence from public universities across the world, and in science more broadly. Secondly, they said, they'll avoid tax. At best for that side, it's sometimes hard to levy business tax as effectively. We note that that is deep on the comparative, far less so than things like individual tax. Note Warren Buffett paid 15% income tax. Business tax, even when you avoid it, is substantially higher. But we would obviously support some sort of international lobby as per the second topic, and even in the comparative, we're far more likely to get that at a point where we say it's just to tax businesses in the first instance. At the end of this is the worst form of incentive, because it encourages businesses to fire workers, to hire machines, to exist solely for their own benefit, even when they massively harm the environment through things like negative externalities. And for all those reasons, this is an insane idea we oppose.
Thank the second negative for the speech. Call on the third affirmative, which refer to anonymity. Here.
Madam Speaker, we thought it was odd that they wanted to point to BHP and Rio Tinto as the bad people in this debate. Because when they wanted to say that they had avoided taxes, A, that occurred under the status quo, and B, BHP and Rio Tinto literally pulled Australia through the GFC. They provided people with thousands of jobs for the reason that Perth was one of the richest states, yes, the city is not a state, in the country, because they were able to provide that type of benefit. They hired people, right, which meant that less burden on the state to provide welfare. That was so important in this debate, because that was the comparative that they never wanted to grapple with. They said, but you just give money to big bad businesses and everyone loses welfare. The problem was with that logic is that when you allow businesses to have more profits, they were like, the profits, that doesn't go to hiring people. But of course it does, right? When you use profits and you necessarily get taxed away from that, you will hire less people because you have less money from that pool, because your profits is what you're trying to protect. That was ridiculous to say that. What we said on our side of the house is when you hire more Tinto were really good. We thought it fucking saved Australia. So, what am I talking to you about in this speech? Firstly, principally, should we tax corporations, which apparently they decided was like not fair, but we will tell you why. But secondly, who helps the most vulnerable? So firstly, principally, should we tax corporations? They said that this was a really unimportant question in this debate, and it was just like a purely utilitarian calculus, and that was all we used tax for. But that wasn't true, right? Because if that was true, we would always take money away from the most rich in every single circumstance, because taking away $100 from the most wealthy can save 10 lives in Africa, and we would do that to the extent that we would have like a full socialist state, right? Because if that was the only calculus you used to why in which you would tax people, you would use that to the most extent. So they want to say it was purely utilitarian, and they weren't actually implementing that on their side of the house. Clearly there are other principal reasons as to why we allow tax there. So what did we tell you? We told you that it was citizen to citizen. They said, but like corporations receive benefits. The thing was they didn't receive citizenship benefits, right? Which were the most important ones you got under the tax system. These were things like healthcare, welfare, and also the right to vote. We didn't think you got that. They said, but they can affect political things. The problem was that when you had a right to vote, you needed to necessarily tax that person's income. We already got that on our side of the house. We thought you overextended that right when you then doubly tax them. They said it wasn't doubly taxation. We thought that was purely ridiculous. Then they told us, but like wealth, healthcare and wealth and education are provided by the state, and like those people then necessarily help businesses. Firstly, a lot of healthcare and like education isn't necessarily provided by the state. We point you to America. Often businesses have an incentive to provide that under the status quo. But secondly, we thought the reason that like the government necessarily provided healthcare and education wasn't for those businesses, it was for the people that it affected. That's why you tax their income and not the income of the businesses. Like that was ridiculous to say. And the point was why you did it was not for the business. You did it for that person. We thought we already dealt with that burden. And where is the money necessarily lost in this debate? We told you it was from like middle class rights, like rights, those type of things, because those were the people who were necessarily losing. They said, but like businesses we're talking about, like Google and stuff, don't provide that type of training to like abject poor people. Why was that not true? Firstly, because we point you to McDonald's, which is one of the biggest corporations in the world, hires entry-level people all the time and trains them up to the point where like management positions at McDonald's are actually seen as incredibly good training on someone's CV. That's an example of providing the most abject poor in entry-level positions with a job so they don't have to rely on the state for welfare. They have an ability to do that. We thought that was so much better on our side of the house because we told you that businesses were so much better at providing things other than welfare. They said, we got more welfare. The reason that it was better for a business to do that was because a business necessarily had an incentive to hire more people, whereas if you like hand out more welfare, that's only ever a burden to the state. Businesses got something out of hiring more people, they got more profits. We thought it was bad to tax them for those reasons. They said, but businesses get things like bankruptcy benefits. Like we obviously wouldn't give that to them in this instance where they don't pay tax. That was fine. So like, they said, but wealthy people, like the reason that we're principally inconsistent was because wealthy people get less benefit, and that's why like we weren't necessarily taxing people for that. Why was that inconsistent? We told you it was because like they can laugh at our social contract theory all they like, but the reason that wealthy people are okay with paying less tax, paying more tax, I mean, is because the idea of if they were ever to be in that situation, they know their citizenship rights would be protected by that. It was that safety net that we were looking to protect. Businesses never got that safety net, that's why we didn't stand for that. So moving on to the idea of who helps the most vulnerable in this debate. I've already told you, like, onto the idea of who hires more workers. It was really bizarre in this instance that they thought that your profits were not connected to how many people you hired in a business. Like, tax is a cost on you as a business. If you were having that cost, you necessarily have to shuffle your business and restructure in order to hire less people. That was bizarre to say that those things necessarily weren't affected. It was also bizarre to say that tax, that like where you have, and we see that when you have tax increases, right? You necessarily lay off workers. When you have on businesses, you lay off workers. You pass that cost on to the employees, not to the CEO's bonuses. That was where you necessarily got that loss because that was where it was most profitable for that business. So like we thought that was ridiculous. Then they told us, but like we don't stand for inequality and we don't help the most abject poor. So we don't help the most people. We told you that like necessarily under the status quo, when you tax businesses, firstly, that it's like the smaller businesses that necessarily actually get that tax because they have less ability to avoid them. But we also thought that like necessarily when you tax them, it was middle class rights and it was those things like minimum wage that you necessarily got rid of. And we thought their example of when jobs went offshore was like the point of this debate, right? Because when jobs go offshore, they're going to more vulnerable people because they're not facing those type of regulations. We totally stood for that in this debate because that was what was good. That was helping the people who necessarily needed it most. We thought that was so much more beneficial. So they had to do more to prove why that was a bad thing that people in like really terrible countries got jobs over like a middle class person who had better right to in Australia. So we like also into the idea that like abject poor people were locked out under the status quo. We told you the workers' rights protect rights only of current employees, right? So if you are on welfare, you have no right to actually get access to things. Things like unions protected those who were already in the workforce, so you didn't necessarily have as much ability to get that thing. The only way you could actually get access to that was entering the workforce. We told you we got more people in the workforce because when you gave them bigger profits, they were more likely to redistribute them and hire more people. We told you the idea about innovation. They said, but not everyone is Google and Facebook. The point of this argument is that when you have more profits, it doesn't obviously some goes to dividends and shareholders. That's how you get that type of investment. But there is some left over that is used in research and development, is used to be more competitive, that you get a profit out of, and is used and put back in the system. So Sam was wrong when he said 20 years ago lots of people didn't have fridges, but we thought that what's happened over time is now everyone has access to a mobile phone, right? That's only because of that research and development that has helped the lowest people in society. It's really helped really intersectional groups as well. It's helped things like mothers who have to work all day and now have access to a washing machine, right? And now a dishwasher. That has helped them, they're able to self-actualize in better ways because now they have an ability to do that. We thought that was really important in this debate because that was the type of things that research and development got us. Google and Facebook are what we're talking about in this debate, but we also thought there was other type of companies there. They said, they might want to talk about enforceability, they got better enforceability. Your status quo, it sucks under the status quo. That was ridiculous to say that you got more enforceability. We think enforceability is going to be hard on both sides of the house. We thought it was easier with income taxes because it was harder to go offshore with your income, but also the idea that we do it so much better under the status quo. Madam Speaker, we are so proud to propose this very crazy model.
Thank the third affirmative for the speech. Call on the third negative to present theirs. If the third pronoun is he.
In this team's rush to their libertarian wet dream, they're playing a deadly game of bait and switch. Think about their arguments. They're not arguments against corporate tax, they are arguments against tax. Claims like tax is theft. Claims like tax deters economic activity. That was why this team is losing this debate. They had to be comparative, since they had to say, if we were not having corporate tax, what kinds of taxation would we counterfactually have? And we explained why the other alternative that this team had to support was so much worse. I am a libertarian. I believe tax is evil, but I believe in the least of any of the evils, and that is most certainly corporate tax. I'm going to start by asking what firms will do with the extra windfall of profits that I'll get under this policy, and then secondly I'll look at on what principle basis we should choose to tax people, and lastly at the avoidability of tax. So let's begin by asking what firms will do with the extra profits they get. The game plan from the affirmative team is they'll become immensely profitable and then they'll invest in things like innovation and education. The first thing I want to note here is that we just refute this will be such a giant windfall to businesses. They'll be able to invest in those things. For the reason we outlined in our first speaker's speech, which has been seriously unresponded to, which is, if this team envisages anywhere near the current role of the state that we do have, then that would presumably mean that they would have to bump up things like income tax, which would mean that firms would have to pay their workers more, because otherwise, in effective terms, workers would be getting a giant wage cut. The response to that second affirmative is, well, that's just an argument for cutting the social safety net. And there are other problems with cutting the social safety net, but the thing that I want to emphasise is that the level of taxation that we should have net is not an issue in this debate. What is the issue is how we choose to allocate that taxation between different sources of state revenue. And we say that this is not a fundamentally efficient way of doing so. The second thing I want to do here is to refute the second response from second affirmative is, but now the state will have to spend less because Google will do things like schools. Well, that's a very exceptional example for your team. It's unlikely that small or medium-sized enterprises will do those things. And most state services like pensions, an example we gave you at second negative hasn't yet been responded to. Looking forward to hearing it in reply. Not the types of things which businesses could ever find profitable to provide. The second problem with this argument is that we additionally reviewed the claim that what these businesses are getting is going to be funneled into innovation for the reason that Emma explained, which is that these firms have a profit to feed, have a legal obligation in many cases to feed back their profits into dividends. The implicit response to this at first is, but you have to use it for innovation because any other thing you could use it for would end up being taxed, which is not the case for the reason, again, we explained in Emma's speech, which is the affirmative team cannot support taxes on things like capital gains or dividends because if they support those things, those are the same thing as a corporate tax on profits. So that would be so hugely inconsistent that it would be itself essentially a losing blow in the debate. But the last thing I want to note, and this is what I really want to emphasise, is that that is an argument for a tax break on innovation, not an argument for a tax break. And the response to this from second is, well, if a little cut is good, then a big cut must be great, like as though Molly hadn't done year 10 calculus. But the important thing to remember here is that when businesses do things other than innovate, like for example, just take profits for themselves and give them to shareholders, this team was not able to explain why there's a socially productive or a beneficial thing. So let's take into account the exception the affirmative team are talking about Google schools, give Google a tax break, but make sure that companies which are just enriching their own profits pay the social share that they ought to. The other thing I want to emphasise is that if this affirmative team wants innovation, the state can invest in innovation with the taxation revenue that it's getting. The relevant question in this debate is, which is the actor which is best placed to provide those services in an innovative and an effective way? Is it the state, which has a democratic interest to help all citizens, or is it private corporations, which will only do things that occasionally align with the social interest in the very rare circumstance in which it's in their profit? And we say that that's a question that this affirmative team wasn't properly dealing with. The last claim we hear from the affirmative team, this is pushed especially at third, is that firms will do things like hire more workers. We noted that we don't think it is the case that corporate tax deters firms from doing things like creating new profit projects and hiring workers for the reason that corporate tax is not at all distortionary. So a tax on profits, which means that if any project was profitable pre-tax, it will also be profitable post-tax. So because you're essentially taxing both your revenues and your costs, essentially, if you pay workers more or hire more workers, that is tax deductible. But also, think about it in relative terms. Even if the affirmative team encourages more business activity, to whom will that business activity go? It will not go to workers, because now if you do not hire a worker, you pay zero tax. You will just choose to always hire machinery and capital. Again, material we got from our first speaker's speech that this negative team didn't deign to respond to. That's why we think that the risk that these firms would choose to funnel their windfall gains into their own profits rather than into society means that they will not be doing productive things with what they get out of this. Let's secondly look at the principal basis of taxation. So the affirmative team's broad claim is that you don't opt into the social contract. You know, obviously that was well refuted at second when we explained that individuals don't do either. And I think that points to the fact that there are two important burdens the affirmative team has here. One is to explain that the social responsibility of corporations is fundamentally different to those of individuals who they still want to pay tax. And secondly, they need to actually prove a lot to show not just that we should have a low rate of corporate tax, but that we should have zero corporate tax. So when third affirmative is saying things like, well, some state services are provided by businesses and they do some good things, that is not enough in this debate. You need to show they've entirely discharged their social responsibility, and we say that's a burden you've been running away from. We hear from first affirmative that they get no benefit from the social safety net. We think that's just false, to the extent that things like benefits to workers and things like social housing allow firms to pay their workers lower wages, because in real terms it lowers the cost of living for most workers. But also, they benefit through other ways, through things like the education which states provide their citizens. The response at second was, well, individuals pay off those things because they have to pay income tax. And yes, that accounts for the benefit that individuals are getting for that education. It does not account for the benefit that corporations are getting from that education above and beyond what they pay their individuals in wages, because they are also profiting from that education which the state has provided. Lastly though, we know that was not the relevant test to the extent there were broader things like the regulatory environment and bankruptcy laws, to which the third affirmative says, we don't support those things, but what do you support in this debate? Should the state have any regulations which might help businesses? Should they build the infrastructure which allow businesses to deliver their products? Should they have rules about competition that allow new businesses to foster and grow? These are all questions that are deeply unclear from the affirmative team. Their second claim is the problem is that firms have no political power. As our bench laughter indicates, our first response is that is obviously not true, and the firms have a great deal of political power. But also, again, that's not the relevant test. There are lots of voters, like for example, there are lots of people like, for example, migrant workers who might not be voters, but still have a social responsibility to the state to the extent that they're getting a benefit out of it. Lastly, they try to say that the thing is that firms are doing benefit for the community. As I've already flagged, we think there are other ways in which we can provide more benefit to the community.